Welcome back. It's AP Lang, and I was just sitting here reading another fan mail from Matthew Perry. This guy really loves like Thoreau and Into the Wild. I love it because I love these books. This one is asking to explain the theme of arrogance, innocence, and ignorance in Into the Wild, which I believe is a huge theme throughout the entire book because it can be seen as a beneficial thing and also thing that causes Chris's demise ultimately. And each aspect of the theme kind of, bounces off of each other because, first we'll start with innocence. In the beginning of his life, Chris had a very, sheltered life. Even though his family worked a lot, he had money and stuff, but then, his innocence was kind of taken from him because his father and mother were starting their own business. They were working all the time. So he basically had to raise himself with his sister, which brought them closer together, but, separate them from their parents. And ultimately, his innocence was completely taken when he found out about his father's affair, you could call it, but really his affair was with his own mother because he was still married to the other woman at the time. And, the trust of his father really went away, and he wasn't allowed to, be a child. He was more like an adult from a young age, which innocence provides a great theme in the book because, Chris thought that he wasn't innocent anymore. He knew what to do in his life, which, was true in a sense that he had grown up early, but really, when he went on into the wilderness, he was still innocent in some aspects. He didn't know everything, but he thought he knew everything, which also leads into the next one of arrogance. Chris had a lot of arrogance in a lot of aspects of his life. In school, he didn't really make relationships. He was more in the library, learning all he could. At graduation, he was just ready to go. He went on his own a lot because he thought he could handle himself. He had from a young age, and he thought that he could handle whatever, nature, life threw at him. And so that, dealt a lot into what he did ultimately in Alaska, which caused him to die. He was arrogant about his survival skills. The Alaskan bush is no joke. You can't go out there with having extensive knowledge of that area, having enough equipment, enough materials, enough tools, food, everything to survive. And Chris rejected a lot of the materials necessary for that trip. He decided that he could do it on his own, which he knew a lot about the wild, but I think that he took that a little too far when he went into the wild. He thought he knew everything and he rejected help of his friend who offered him equipment, supplies, places to live, rides up there. He thought he could do it on his own, which is understanding from the position that he went off on his own a lot. Summer before college, he went off and he searched for his father's family and everything, and he went off a lot, and he had survived 2 years previous to this. He knew that he could hitchhike, he could do whatever. He lost his car, but that really fed into his own area, and he thought since he went to college and, knew a lot about a lot of areas that he could just reject other aspects of surviving, which ultimately led to him starving in the Alaskan bush and dying. And that feeds into ignorance. Arrogance and ignorance play into each other because when you're arrogant, you think you know everything, when really you're ignorant in some areas. And Chris stayed away. He really rejected a lot of human interaction. Although he met a lot of people and made a lot of good friends along the way, a lot of his human interaction was more for the other person. He was fine alone because he thrived on individualism. He thought that himself and nature was the main goal. His goal was not to interact with others or to, connect ties so much as to make sure he could survive. And he just left them with enough to remember him, but not so much to where that he would be attached to them, which is kind of ignorant because these people can really help you and care about you to, make your life easier. But he didn't keep in touch with his parents. He only called his sister like once, and it drove them insane. They hired a private investigator. He didn't think about the consequences of his actions towards the people that cared about him, even if he didn't think they cared about him anymore. It just took extensive toll on everybody that he, who cared about him. Rather, he was worried about himself, which is the ignorance of, that selfish mindset. Also, he was sort of ignorant in what he did in Alaska and other places. He didn't fully prepare himself to go into the winter cold without the supplies he needed. He only had a bag of rice that would last him time, but he needed substantial meat and berries, and he was eventually starving in Alaska. When he killed the moose, he didn't smoke it in the right way. Smoking wasn't the right thing to do with that meat. And he had a lot of it went to waste. He didn't even eat a lot of it, which caused him to have internal turmoil, and he suffered greatly internally because he didn't utilize what he did, and that moose ended up going to waste, when really he could have saved a lot of that meat if he knew the proper techniques and how to save it, as many of the Alaskan people do. And so he was ignorant in that aspect. And while he was not ignorant in the berries that he chose to eat, because they were correct, as Krakauer later pointed out, that they were not poisoned or anything. They didn't switch them up as the movie would like to suggest, but rather it was the mold that went on the berries as they accumulated in the wet area. But he was ignorant in that he didn't bring enough food to where he was reduced to that, and ultimately died because of the poison of them all coming together. So it was a great mistake in that point. And Chris's life had some great triumphs, and he was very intelligent and personable and friendly and all of that stuff. He did suffer from these great flaws that a lot of Americans and people across the world experience: arrogance, innocence, and ignorance, which causes a lot of the downfalls in society. And so Chris is not alone in his thinking of this, in his characteristics, but he took them to the extreme to where they ended in his death and a lot of pain for a lot of people he cared about. So, but I think that Krakauer just wants to highlight how small you think, how life can be insignificant, you think, but really has a great impact on everything. So you've got to take everything into account and think about what you're doing, even if it is your passion. All right, I hope that answers your question, and we'll be right back with one more question before the end of our segment. Thanks.